question, what is our role in missionary care? So my wife and I, our ministry is missionary care. So we go about, we did Wednesday night, make a presentation in a church about missionary care. And it's amazing, pastors, without exception, after a presentation on missionary care, pastors and people say, I never thought about that. Mm-hmm. It's never occurred to me. Now, it's not that I'm so smart. There's reasons behind that, why missionary care is not a priority in our circles, and we could talk about that like over lunch. Why isn't it? But it isn't. And so we my wife and I travel and speak at mission conferences, mission emphasis Sundays, and present the subject of missionary care. And it's very hard for pastors. We can speak very freely here. There's 4 of us. Very hard for pastors because they're smart enough to know. My wife and I are supported as missionaries. We don't get a salary. We're supported as missionaries. Pastors can only support so many missionaries and have so many. We completely understand that. And we feel a certain obligation. If we're inviting you in, we should prayerfully consider maybe we could support you. What we try to do is find an open doors to make priests tell about missionary care, challenge the church about missions, and let the Lord touch the hearts he touches with no expectation. The Lord touches hearts, and but the bigger subject is missionary care. So 2 verses here, they're right in the booklet. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. Boy, I love that. Yeah. Like, man, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Mm-hmm. Proverbs 17. And then Proverbs 18:14. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit who can bear. Now, this is not the nuts and bolts, sitting a chair to chair with a person dealing with post-traumatic stress. This is not quite that, because that's kind of a subject all its own. It's more from our pastor's perspective, a little bit further up. Like, what can we do? How can a missionary be helped? And you'll know there are 2 aspects of this. One is preventative. And so I'll just go through these for you. One is past trauma should be explored in the application and interview process of a prospective missionary. So as pastors, there are supporting pastors, right? And there are sending pastors. If we're not the sending pastor, we're counting on somebody to have done the proper work screening a missionary. We're counting on somebody. And we are a mission board, so we're not anti-mission board. But let me just say to you, men, nothing should be assumed. We shouldn't assume that a mission board, even GFF, is doing, a pastor that's a supporting pastor is a steward of missionary dollars. Mm-hmm. A pastor is a sending pastor is a steward of a missionary, right? So it's got to be explored. In my opinion, outside of a clear salvation testimony and evidence of growing spiritual maturity, I don't think there's anything more important than the issue of past trauma. Because, we're dealing with a bit of a different generation. I'm not naive to think that because I'm 62, when I was 10 years old, things weren't going on then. But it wasn't empowered. It was pretended these things don't exist. It was pretended there are no dysfunctional families today. Remember the TV show, the Dick Van Dyke Show? Do you know, Pastor, can you remember the Dick? You probably can. Can you?
I do.
Well, in the Dick Van Dyke Show, do you remember in the Dick Van Dyke Show, they had bedroom scenes of Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore? And they slept in separate beds.
Yeah.
Dick Van Dyke came to the table for supper with a tie on.
Yeah.
My 3 sons. Leave it to Beaver. Mm-hmm. We're not naive enough to think that life was somehow way, way cleaner then. Maybe in some ways it was, because as we work our way toward the end of the age, things are more accepted. But we should never assume that, a person has not dealt with trauma. And we should never assume that someone filling out a standard reference form knows or is able to share what they know about trauma in the life of a prospective missionary. Yeah. It's not something a candidate should be expected to tell. They need to be asked. I'm talking about in their application process. I don't think it's a pastor of a supporting church's role to say to a missionary wife, now about trauma in your life when you were a child or a teen. I don't think that's a supporting pastor's role. But a supporting pastor has to be confident of the boards. The boards that we need to know that the boards that we deal with Deal with it in a way that we as a pastor think is the way it should be. I don't want to dictate to you how you should do it. But so it's something that needs to be. So letter B, post-traumatic stress should be taught and reviewed regularly in the life of a missionary. There are very, very few missionaries that if you go visit them on the field and say, look, let's just talk about traumatic things here in your ministry. Very, very few are going to look at you and say, yeah, man, it's bad. It's really, really bad. I deal with traumatic things all the time. Most missionaries are going to say, yeah, pastor, hey, not a problem here. Problem a lot of places, not a problem here. Until and unless you build up a relationship with them. Because missionary care grows out of a relationship, if you follow what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Letter C, missionary care relationships should be developed early in a missionary's career and maintained intentionally. Now you might be thinking, Pastor, I'm not sure if this is our role. But what your role is to know that the boards, if you're a supporting pastor, that the boards you support are on top of these things, that they're aware of these things. And to be honest with you, a pastor has so many, sometimes I say to Rodney, like, Rodney, how are you doing? Like, he is the director. I'm not an administrator. He's the administrator. So I said to him one day, how you doing? He said, well, I'm like the lion tamer, holding the chair out, and there's more than 4 legs. So I understand, Pastor, there's a lot of things for you to do. But the fulfilling of I don't want to be unkind. There probably aren't many things that should take precedent over the Great Commission. And the idea that we've been at this 2,000 years, and there's 3,800 language groups that don't have a word in their language. Mm-hmm. Missions needs to be a real priority to us. And I'm of the opinion, probably a bigger load than the average pastor can carry. He probably needs a group in his church that helps facilitate some missionary interaction. When we teach on missionary care in some other places, I'll talk more about that. But what pastor only has so much time, so many hours, and getting all these letters and requests. There's missionaries out there, and the missionaries are with a board, and we rightfully assume the board's on top of these things, respectfully. Some are, respectfully, many are not. And I'm not being unkind. Many are not. So a missionary care relationship's got to be developed early in a missionary's career and maintained. Letter D, excellent Bible teaching and preaching should not be considered adequate ministry to field missionaries. Right. So here's what this means to you, Pastor. So missionary board, you have missionaries out there. How do you minister to them on the mission field? Well, once a year we have a field conference where we bring some really well-known preachers in to preach to our missionaries. Respectfully, that is not adequate care for a missionary, especially today. Most of them can get good preaching over the internet. I was talking with a missionary, won't tell you the mission board, it doesn't matter, and I'm trying to learn, and I said, so what is a field conference in your mission? Like, what is a field conference? He said, well, see, they first figure out, and rightfully so, is this confidential? Because he's just being honest. Right. I said, yeah, no, I really want to know. I said, I'm trying to learn. I'm not trying to criticize anybody. He said, in our mission, a field conference is, we set aside a few days where we pay our own way to a central place, where we bring our Western Sunday dress and hold Western-style church services with a guest preacher from America who's probably a really excellent preacher, and we raise the money for his expenses and his wife, and we take an offering to give him a gift for going. And we listen to that excellent preaching. Pause. And then he looked at me and said, Pastor, we stopped going. It was such a burden financially, and his point was, how can you speak against good preaching? If I said, look, have we got a surprise, men, for you today? We talked to your wives and found out who your favorite preachers are, and they're right outside that door, and they're coming in to preach right now. When you got in your car to go home, you'd say, well, that was good, but I could have gone and heard him on my own. That's how missionaries feel about typical field conference. It's not. Letter E, missionaries should be required to participate in a professional debriefing for their benefit versus the agency's benefit when they're returning. What?
Can I insert something?
Of course.
There, if I could?
Yeah.
Just a word of personal, not personal me experience, but that I'm aware of. In one particular country in Africa, we had a missionary, and there was another there were a lot of other missionaries from another board that were in that country. They were independent Baptists. Our missionary was independent Baptist, all right? That other board had a annual conference where all of the missionaries were to do exactly what you were just describing to do, and that's exactly how it was. So and most of them all had, well, all of them, they all had kids, varying ages. They would go to that preaching conference for them. Well, our missionary was invited to go. He wanted to go because he wanted his kids to be able to have fellowship with the other kids their age, a big thing on the field. Wants to be around other kids that are going through common life experiences, make connections, whatever. He went a couple of times and he stopped going. He started going to another conference that was being put on by a more evangelical crowd that was in the same country, not because he liked them better or he could relate to them better, but because in their conference they had the same amount of missionaries went, same kind of ages of kids that went, but they had two things that were different. Number one, they had games and activities that were relatable to the children that they were able to participate in. The primary thing wasn't sitting with the adults and listen to the preaching. They had broken up into children's. They had nursery that was provided the care by someone from the States. It wasn't a rotation of missionary wives. And then they had young children, puppet shows and whatever, activities and games. And for the teenagers, they had full schedule of activities and games and debriefing, stuff like that. And then for the adults, they had an available counselor that could set up, write down appointments to meet one-on-one at different times of the day. So they got more help that kept them on the field and more effective on the field longer. However, because the kids grew up now for several years, associating with teenagers that have nose rings and lip piercings and 3 colors of hair and half shaved because of the evangelical crowd, guess what some of their kids they're struggling with now? Yep. That very thing. And so the strictness of one pushed a missionary way. The acceptance of the other was a great help to them, but also a detriment at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you, Rodney. Under letter C, I missed a couple things in my notes. They're not written in your notes. Administrative relationship should not be interpreted as a missionary care relationship. As you men are, and look, Rome wasn't built in a day. And this is no criticism. If the missionary care approach, your mission approach to understand missionary care, but you're supporting missionaries, isn't a high priority, I have no criticism for you whatsoever. There's only so many things we can do. As that expands, and you say to a mission board, so tell me about the missionary care, how do you approach missionary care? If you listen very closely, what you often hear is administrative oversight. Missionaries do not interpret administration as care.
Right.
They say we're over-administrated, under-cared for. But they're not going to announce that. And under letter C also, it should never be assumed somebody's ministering to a missionary. So letter E is about missionary debriefing. And I'll let you read that on your own time. If the Lord tarries next year, I think missionary debriefing is where a missionary sits with professionals to unwind the term they were just on in private and process the term that's coming. And it's not done by the board. It's done by an outside group.
Right.
And we're looking for a missionary debriefing. See, the problem is in our circles, we don't know of an independent Baptist debriefing ministry. We do not know of one. It may be there.
That's not administrative.
It's not administrative. We haven't found one yet.
Right.
And so, we're among friends, so I have a prayer request. I'm going to be, and Rodney knows I'm going to do this. I'm doing it with his permission. I'm going to be reaching out to our board soon and encourage them to prayerfully consider trusting the Lord for the funds. The mission can't afford it, to send Rodney and his wife to a missionary debriefing in 2022 for their own benefit, and so that he can stand in front of missionaries and speak with knowledge about debriefing. It's one of the most needed things is for missionaries to participate in a debriefing. But it's like first responders. If you say to the average first responder who goes to a horrific whatever and say to the first responder, you think maybe you should sit down and talk to the chaplain or anything? What are most responders going to say? I'm great, man. But Bill, you better get Bill in there. He's a mess. So going forward, I'm not an administrator at GFF. Going forward, I expect that going through a debriefing when you return to the United States will be required of GFF missionaries. For new ones, you can't tell an existing missionary to do that. It wasn't their agreement. And we'll encourage them that a certain little bit of their support, $50 a month, $25 a month, be set aside so when they come home, they can participate in a several-day missionary debriefing. Men, with all due respect, a much better investment of a church's funds than what's typically called a mission trip would be to invest in a missionary being debriefed.
Right.
Sam in Iowa is going to speak on mission trips at our table talk in Pleasantville, Iowa next week. So, yes, sir.
Just explain, what do you mean by debriefing? Is it more similar to like a military?
It would be similar to, it's for personal benefit. Good question, Pastor. It's for personal benefit. It's not for GFF's benefit. Not to sound negative. Some missions do debriefing. Some missions called debriefing, but this is how it works. So Rodney, now you were there for 3 or 4 years, that was good. Now your field director was Brother Hammond. Now, how is he doing, Brother Hammond, at administrating on the field? How's the cohesive, that is a kind of debriefing. The debriefing we're speaking of is, Rodney, tell us what you've been through. Tell us how it affected you. Lynn, tell us how this affected you. And for someone, it's someone they don't know who's trained to do this. So that, and to process it and sort of close the chapter with a nice, yeah, okay, now you're getting ready to go. So let's talk about the next chapter, your next turn. Because missionaries come to a church, they get 10, maybe 15 minutes, and I'm not criticizing, and we say, yeah, tell us what happened in the last years. They can't tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right.
They're going to tell you what they think you want to hear. You want a good report, they're going to give you a good report. They're going to give you a good report. Again, they're not lying. They know. In fact, we had a missionary with our mission who gave an honest report, and I just happened to bump into a pastor who had no idea who I was. And he criticized one of our own missionaries for telling it the way it was. And he said, we decided probably we're not going to be supporting them anymore. I said, whoa, Pastor, stop. I said, this is what he was doing. He was telling you the truth. And he thought he was in an environment where the truth wasn't going to cost him. He felt he could trust the truth, and he might have even been in a vulnerable. Debriefing is all that's done, but it's done somewhere else. So the good, the bad, and the ugly is told, processed, a period put at the end of the sentence, in private with a professional, not connected to the organization. Then the missionary prepares the good to go forward and tell in their churches as they report, if that makes any sense.
So it's just missionary going over
Yes.
some of the things they've.
Let me clarify that if I could.
And primarily emotionally,
Yeah.
relationally. Not we started 2 churches. It's, it's the emotional, go ahead, Rodney,
So what that might look like, for example, first of all, like he said, it usually comes from someone that has 2 character traits. Number one, they've been on the field a long time. Maybe
and they're done that.
been there and done that. So you're looking at someone from Africa, a missionary from Africa, being debriefed by a seasoned veteran missionary from Africa, either still is or no longer anymore. All right. Number 2. So number 1, someone who has gone through similar life experiences in missions. Number 2, someone who is not an administrator at their mission board. All right. He's not a white collar, a white shirt guy.
And he doesn't provide a report to the mission board.
And he doesn't, exactly. Okay, so those are the 2 character traits. This is what it's going to look like. All right, Brett, I'm setting down. Sean, you've been on the mission field for 4 years. I know from following your work that you've had a falling out with a national who tried to steal your church property. I know that your house has been broke in twice. I know that your children saw people that were killed in front of them in a car accident. Bicycles got ran straight over by traffic, and that you had to carry one of those people to a bush hospital with your children sitting in the back of the car on either side, watching this man bleed out through a tourniquet on his leg, and then you dropped him. I know these events happen. This is the normal response that people in these abnormal circumstances normally have. Number one, there's feelings of regret and bitterness and betrayal, not wanting to move forward or becoming overly sensitive and negative towards nationals. Maybe not yourself, but your wife, all right? Because she's had her trust betrayed. This is how kids, and so the debriefers say, well, give a list. These are the normal circumstance responses that others typically have when they go through those experiences. Have you had any of those types of feelings? Because you're giving them a framework to understand what they've gone through, but they've not had the time to process themselves.
Yeah.
And they're like, so for example, we had a missionary just come off the field after 10 years on the field. And we came off the field from a very similar environment, almost the same environment as him and his family, just under 4 years earlier. I was talking to him on the phone. By the way, he decided that they were not going to go through any type of debriefing when they come back to the States, except for what they can process their own selves as their own family. And so he was like what you were talking about. Other people need to go through that. I don't think that we need to go through that. We're not going to go through that. And since he was on the field for many years before I became the director, that is something that I can't make retroactive to other missionaries that have been serving under us. Else I take the part of an authoritative role in their ministry over their church. Okay, so anyway, I'm talking to him on the phone. I said, brother, when I came back and my family came back, I felt like we were left behind, that we were coming back to a world that is different than the world that we left, and we don't know how to respond to it. And almost like we are aliens in our own land. This is what he said to me, holding back both the tears and the laughter. That's exactly how I feel. See what I'm saying? He didn't know how to present it that way, but he felt it that way. So a debriefer is someone who's felt that way. Sorry. Secondly, he's had the opportunity to process it biblically, humbly, spiritually with other people, and now he's reaching out to help him. See that? That's the type of debriefing we're talking about.
And here's a key element, and he's not going to tell anybody.
Yeah.
It's not his job to say,
Except I just
Brother,
told you.
no, Brother Hammond, we debriefed that missionary.
This is what I found out.
This is what he told me.
Right.
No. Go ahead. One of you was about to speak. Go ahead, Pastor.
So it sounds like that personally for a missionary going through it, the debriefer is able to help give them a broader context as to, so the missionary doesn't feel like, oh, we're the only ones who've been
And no one understands this.
or felt fearful,
Yeah.
and it helps them to see.
You're not the only one going through this.
perspective. Yeah.
There is light at the end of the tunnel. And listen, here's a wrong philosophy that's almost always grasped, usually by the family on the field. The way that things are now is the way they're always going to be. A debriefer is able to say, the way that things are now are not the way they're always going to be.
Yeah, for hope.
Yeah, exactly. The power of the wisdom that is shared with a missionary that says, going back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are ye who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. All right? Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. This is not unique to you. This is common. All right? There is a greater plan that's unfolding here rather than what you're going through, and it has an eternal effect. It's not just mundane things that are happening to you in the corner of the world that really have no effect one way or the other. Your life is not being spent for no reason at all.
Do you think part of the, I know that when, I don't know what the numbers are, but there's the highest number of missionaries coming off the field is the first term, or during the first term, may not even make it.
That's true.
And there's a lot of reasons for it, culture shock, and I think the emotional side, the dramatic part of it, I think is a big factor. Do you think there's also a side of it that more churches don't deal with in a realistic way about living for God and what true discipleship means? Because
Right.
if you look at the Apostle Paul's life, the health and wealth gospel and the Apostle Paul's life don't fit.
Right.
That you serve God and everything's gonna be rosy and you're
Yeah,
not
no
gonna face
problems,
no
yeah.
problems except for the beating, shipwreck,
Right. Right.
going without. I mean, he faced a lot of difficulties. So do you think that's a factor, or do you think it's just the bigger factor is just all of the emotional changes?
Okay. So you probably have something to say about that. I have something to say about that first. Hopefully it's not the same thing. But if it is, we could repeat it. That's fine. Here's the question I think that you're asking, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm off on this, but this is what you're asking. Are the missionaries that are going out today lesser than what they were 40 or 50 years ago? As in spiritual depth, maturity, discipleship. Whereas if they had a greater degree of spiritual roots, a greater degree of relying on God, and better trained and discipled and walking with the Lord, there would be fewer people coming home at the end of their first term. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't put it that way, but is there an issue with the sending churches or whatever's feeding into the missionary
I understand. As far as those who are preparing the missionaries,
Right.
Sending church, personal responsibility for training, Bible colleges training them for I think that all three of those play a heavy role in the missionaries are not made like they were 50 years ago, all right? To a large degree. That is a real thing, all right? Here's the second thing, a part of it, all right? There is a certain degree of stress that any human being can go through, and no matter how strong, how prepared, how well their background is, looking for that moment is going to be too much, all right? You're going to go from anywhere from, if you think about the idea of a soldier that serves on the field, those who have been very well trained go to the field, come back with debilitating trauma for the rest of their life. Not because of the training they didn't lack. They had all of the real life training that was in boot camp, all right? They were yelled at, they were screamed at, they were waterboarded, they were whatever, they were simulated battles, simulated captured, traumatized, all those things to get them prepared for it. But they go to the field, they come back, and they are debilitating trauma, all right? Maybe their personality set them for that already. But it's common, there is a threshold that any human being, no matter who they are, what their personality is, or what the amount of training is, they're going to cross that threshold. It's a smaller percentage, not going to be half, maybe 10%, maybe more, but they're going to cross that threshold where it's going to be debilitating, and there's nothing that could have been done to change it. All right? So you've got both. Does that make
Right,
sense?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and I'm not saying those are the two things, because I
Right.
know there are people that say, well, just, trust God and stuff, well, that.
But you
that
got to
does
know,
not-
you got to know how to trust God in this circumstance, right?
Right.
And so the number one reason, and I think Brother Chris would agree with this, the number one reason why 50% of the missionaries return, who planned on being long-term on the field, who come home after the first term, never to go back, I would say as much as 70% or more of the time, it was for preventable reasons.
Yeah, statistically, 70% of missionary attrition could be avoided, and they say the primary issue is preparation. Go ahead,
Do you mean, not that the traumatic experience could be prevented, but that their
Preparation
not
for-
even their reaction could be prevented, but their spiritual preparation to
How to
deal-
process it. Yep.
Right, that's the thing.
Yes, spiritually, and because of a spiritual response to it, being able to help the entire family unit to respond to it, and because it's on a spiritual level, it also includes an emotional, intellectual, logical, social level too. We could pinpoint one, how to deal with it on a social level. All right? But that's assumed in the responding to it on a spiritual level. Those are all a part of that. So you can isolate the social level. We dealt with it that way. The emotional level, we dealt with it that way. Did you deal with it on a spiritual level? All right?
Yeah, it's kind of, this discussion's excellent. It's sort of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Because on side one, they need a depth of we all need a depth of spiritual maturity. I shouldn't say they, we do. Like, for example, we need today in America to rethink our theology about suffering.
Yes.
Right.
We have a generation of young people that have
Yes.
been raised to believe you don't hurt.
Amen.
So we live in a dangerous world. We live in a difficult world. The world's not getting better. So if you don't have spiritual roots that has a biblical theology of suffering, that if something's going wrong, it's bad. So we need that. Then the other side of that is we need the practical preparation that this spiritual addresses. It's just like, so the Lord allowed me to serve as a pastor for 39 years. I thought I knew it all in year one and year two. And now I know what they meant when I was in school, and they said the longer I live, the more I don't know. So there is a need for I use the word deep, I just mean a more, so, pastors, we all have our opinion. Like discipleship, I'm just going to speak my opinion, you don't have to agree with me. Discipleship, typically in our circles, is 12 theology lessons.
Yeah. Right.
And once you've done, you're a disciple. But disciple involves discipline. It's the discipline of feeding yourself from the Word. It's the discipline of prayer. It's the discipline of working your way through suffering and not turning on God. And so, sure, Pastor, you're right on, as far as I'm concerned, and it's two sides of the same coin. The person who has excellent training about post-traumatic stress, but does not have spiritual discipleship, a depth of spiritual, and is helped with that. We all always need help. A guy said to me Wednesday night in a church, you need to be careful. You need to be helped. You're helping people. Be helped. He was saying, you're going to go to pieces if you're not helped. He's so true for all of us. If I was sitting at a table talk, and you can tell we're very passionate about these things, and we've got so much to say, we're like a balloon ready to burst. I kind of envision pastors going out saying, I think Rodney and Chris think that I have about 70 million improvements I need to make in missions.
Right.
No. What we're saying is, it's not up to us, but it's we can all do better somewhere.
Right.
And when we do a little bit better somewhere, it improves that. Pastor, it's true. It's the first term. If they make it through a first term, the majority do not return after the first. What percentage doesn't return after their first term? 50% don't go back after the first term. So you're right on. So if I was just sitting here and I'd go out And I think, man, number one, if those guys looked at our mission program, they'd think, these guys don't know this pastor doesn't know what he's doing. And number two, I have so many improvements to make. It's like when you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you need to, blah, 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 blah. We're not saying that. We're saying, Pastor asked, Lord, what can we do to just help with that crisis in missions? I kind of look at debriefing, and maybe we're hoping, the Lord willing, if the Lord allows us to return to this area and he tarries, to have a session, we'll have a session or two on debriefing, and have one of us or both of us have been through debriefing with our wives.
Right.
So we can say, Pastor, here's something you could consider. I look at it as a little bit like going to the doctor. Like, how many men do you meet who like going to the doctor?
I haven't been to the
Right?
doctor.
And so then when we're going to go to the doctor, we're hoping it'll last about 30 seconds.
Right.
Yeah, doctor, how are you? Great. How are you? And you know, some doctors will let you do that. They'll say, okay, 30 seconds, great, it's $350 you pay right out there.
Right.
Some doctors are going to look you in the eye. Chris, you're 62 years old. I have a few questions. Right? Mm-hmm. And when I walk out through the door, the doctor's not going to put on Facebook, Chris Lupino was here, 62 years old, and guess what he's got problems with? Whatever it might be. That's debriefing. The person who knows what to ask, knows how to help you process it, knows how to help you think. Go ahead, Pastor.
Just a question about the objectives of debriefing. Like your doctor, they know if you're 62, there's certain issues that they could predict. I'm going to need to deal with these issues because you're 62. Right? Or at least I may need to be able
Sure.
to. But the doctor is also assessing, right? What
Right.
else might I need to help you with? And where there's a need, they would refer you off to a specialist for help in that area. Do you view debriefing similarly? You know you're going to deal with certain predictable issues with anyone coming off the field, but you also want to, that debriefer, one of their goals is assessing what else, what other emotional, spiritual, practical needs exist, and recognizing we're not going to be able to fix all that in 2 or 3 days, so we want to kind of help define some of those issues and give them counsel about how to follow up and getting those things addressed in the coming weeks and months. Is that part of the
Absolutely.
debriefing as well?
Absolutely. So so at the end of this debriefing, they might say, you know, so Bill and Mary, you know, and we have had a missionary go through debriefing, and we're learning from their experience, and we're doing research. We were communicating by text with email with a debriefer yesterday. But exactly, an honest debriefer is going to tell you the truth. Look in the eye and say, listen, so we have a few recommendations, because it's done with a man and his wife. My wife and I have a couple recommendations for you folks, right? We're not going to force you, we're not going to tell you, but we think there's need for some follow-up here.
Maybe marital strife
Right,
needs to be
and
addressed in a greater way.
you can follow up with us. We can references who we would suggest you follow up. Absolutely, definitely. It's packaging the past and thinking through anything needed here to go forward. So that's definitely, you know, definitely, Pastor. That's exactly how it is. And Pastor,
So to kind of summarize it, the debriefing is more of like an emotional checkup as opposed to physical.
yes, and you could say relational. It's a relational checkup. And I left the field. I worked with the Hammonds, and I don't know Mrs. Hammond, so this is Pastor. There's only 2-3 of us here. I pick on, and you know, and it's also, you know, wives get really neglected on the mission field. They get very easily overlooked, and so it's, you know, so Mr. and Mrs. Hammond, you're on the field. You were working with the Myers, and Mrs. Hammond, you've expressed some real concerns about Mrs. Myers, and